He thought he was just helping a lost girl in the snow. But when her tribe returned with something he never expected, everything he thought was gone came back to life. If stories of kindness, healing, and second chances speak to your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Every week, we share true-to-life tales that remind us sometimes the smallest act of compassion can lead to the greatest miracles. Ready to begin? Let's step into the snow and follow the drum that brought her home. The wind had a sound. That morning, a low, pulsing moan that curled between the trees like an animal unsure of its path. Snow was falling in that gentle, relentless way it does in late winter in New Mexico. Everything was white, even the edges of memory. Colter Shaw adjusted the collar of his worn flannel jacket and stepped off the back porch. The boards creaked behind him, and his boots sank slightly into the fresh snow. He scanned the tree line, listening. He wasn't sure what for. A coyote, maybe. Or silence itself. "Stay inside, Mason," he called without turning. Behind the frosted window, a small shadow shifted Mason. His 7-year-old son was already up, already watching as he did every morning, since his mother disappeared 2 years ago. He hadn't spoken since Colter trudged forward, axe in hand toward the creek, where the old ash tree had fallen in the last storm. The wood was dry inside, perfect for the fire they needed to keep the stove going through the cold snap. He moved carefully the way a man moves, who has learned to live with silence, with grief, with the weight of needing to be both mother and father, and sometimes more. As he neared the creek, he saw it a small, dark shape lying half buried in the snow just off the path. For a second, his heart caught in his throat. A deer, a bear cub, a trick of the wind. It was a girl. Colter dropped the axe. She was curled on her side, barely moving, her face pressed against her arm. Her skin was bronze. Lips tinged blue from the cold. Snow dusted her long black hair. She was older than 20. Wrapped tightly around her chest was a hand-woven blanket, and beneath one arm, astonishingly, she clutched a drum. A small, round hand drum like those he'd seen at the native powwows his late wife used to bring him to Jesus. He muttered, crouching low. He brushed snow from her face. Her eyelashes flickered. Her breathing was shallow, but there. He looked around, but there were no tracks, only her own already half filled by new snow. No horse, no bag, no trail. Colter hesitated, bringing someone back to his cabin, especially someone hurt. Especially a stranger wasn't something he'd done in a long time. But then again, what kind of man walks away? He scooped her into his arms. She weighed less than Mason. The drum thudded lightly against his side with each step, back up the hill. Inside the cabin, Mason stood frozen in the doorway, eyes wide, fingers twitching near his lips. "It's okay," Colter said gently, brushing past him and laying the girl on the worn couch near the stove. "She's hurt, but I think she's going to make it." He peeled off her wet blanket and boots, then wrapped her in an old quilt. Mason crept closer, eyes flicking between her and the drum, which now rested on the floor. His small hand reached out, but didn't touch it, just hovered above the hide as if feeling for something deeper. Colter knelt by the stove, feeding in wood, the heat building. His hands trembled slightly. He hadn't been this close to another adult in months. His days were measured by chores, silence, and the sound of Mason's bare feet on wood floors. But now this girl, this stranger, had shattered that rhythm in a single moment. As the warmth returned to her face, she stirred. Her eyes opened, dark, almond-shaped, scanning quickly like an animal waking in a cage. "You're safe," Colter said softly. "You're in my home. I found you near the creek. Can you understand me?" She blinked but said nothing. "I'm Colter. "This here's my son, Mason." He motioned toward the boy who stood holding the drum, now staring at her with something like wonder. The girl slowly sat up, her hand flying to her head. She winced and drew her knees up defensively. Coulter raised both palms. "It's okay. You don't have to speak." She didn't. She just looked at the drum, then at Mason, who now gently tapped the side of it with his small fingers. A rhythm. 1, 2. Pause. 1, 2. Pause. The girl's eyes softened. For a long moment, no one spoke. The fire cracked. The wind outside shifted, and Mason kept drumming. Coulter spent the rest of the day tending to her quietly warming broth, offering her clean clothes, watching her closely as she walked the small length of the cabin barefoot. She never said a word, but she stayed. And Mason, who had not touched anyone outside his father since his mother's disappearance, now sat beside her shoulder to shoulder, watching her fix a tear in the drum's skin. That night, Coulter lay awake, listening to the sound of her gentle breathing from the couch. Mason had insisted on sleeping nearby, bundled under the big quilt, like a pup beside a fire. Coulter stared at the ceiling. He didn't know who she was or where she came from, but he knew that she was meant to be found. That moment by the creek wasn't chance. It was something else. Something deeper. He turned to look at Mason. The boy was asleep, a peaceful look on his face that Coulter hadn't seen in over 2 years. And in his small hand, still resting against his chest, was the girl's drum. By morning, the snow had stopped falling, but the cold had settled into the land, like a quiet warning. The mountains that ringed Coulter's cabin glistened under a fresh white coat. He stepped outside, coffee steaming in his hand, and looked up at the sky, clear and high, and far too still. When he stepped back, the girl was awake. She stood barefoot on the edge of the rug, wrapped in one of Coulter's flannel shirts. Sleeves rolled awkwardly past her wrists. Her long black hair had dried into soft waves overnight, and she looked smaller in the morning light, as if the fire had burned off some of her mystery. Mason was already up, sitting cross-legged a few feet away, eyes locked on her like she might disappear. Coulter nodded a quiet greeting. "Morning." The girl didn't respond with words, but her eyes met his. She held his gaze cautious but steady. Then, with a subtle motion, she pressed her palm to her chest, then toward him. It was the kind of gesture Coulter hadn't seen in years. He recalled it from his wife's college days studying indigenous languages. A greeting. "Thank you, maybe both." "I wish I knew your name," Coulter said. She pointed to the drum, then touched her heart. "Your name is?" He hesitated. "Drum." She shook her head just barely, then placed her hand gently on the drum and tapped it once with her fingers. A soft sound, not quite a beat. Her expression changed. A shadow flickered across it. Then resolve, she pressed her palm to her chest again, then made a motion like wind over grass. Coulter frowned naively. He tried saying the first name that came to mind from his wife's old vocabulary lists. It meant "I love you" in the APACHE dialect she once studied. To his surprise, the girl nodded. Coulter's voice caught naily beside her. Mason tapped once on the drum, the same soft beat. 1, 2, pause. Coulter didn't miss the way her eyes watered slightly at the sound. By noon, the sun broke through the clouds. Coulter spent the day cutting firewood and mending the fence, while Mason stayed indoors with Nayeli. Through the cabin window, Coulter caught glimpses, Mason pointing at books, Nayeli showing him how to stretch animal hide, the two of them exchanging quiet rhythms on the drum. It was the most animated Mason had been in 2 years. Later that day, Coulter walked in to find Mason standing beside Nayeli, both looking at a faded map of the nearby hills spread across the kitchen table. Her finger traced the ridgeline east of the creek, then to a small, weather-worn symbol etched into the wood. It was a spiral. Coulter blinked. "That's old," he muttered. "I think my grandfather marked that spot before I was born." Never knew what for, Nayeli looked at him, then back at the map. She pointed again firmly. "You're saying you came from there?" She nodded. Mason pointed to himself, then to the same spot. Coulter sighed. "No, buddy. We're not going on an adventure. Not while it's this cold." But both of them, Mason and Nayeli, were already staring at him, like he was the one being unreasonable. That night, Coulter sat alone by the fire after putting Mason to bed. Nayeli sat across the room, her feet tucked beneath her, sewing a tear in one of Mason's gloves. Her movements were precise, patient, familiar. "How long were you out there?" he asked, his voice low. "In the snow before I found you." She looked up, tapped 3 fingers on the table. 3 hours. She shook her head, then pointed outside, drew a circle in the air. "A sun, 3 days. Coulter cursed under his breath. "And you survived." Nayeli touched the drum, then placed her hand on her heart again. He didn't know what to say. He hadn't spoken this much in months, not to anyone outside of Mason. But now, with this quiet girl who didn't use words, he found himself wanting to fill the space. Not with explanations, but with presence. "You remind me of someone," he said quietly. "She used to drum too." Nayeli looked up. "My wife," he said. "Willa." He pulled down an old photo from the mantel. It was faded edges, curled in it. Willa stood in the same flannel shirt Nayeli wore, now smiling with one hand on her pregnant belly and the other on a drum she'd made herself. The resemblance wasn't exact, but there was something in the eyes. Nayeli took the photo gently. Her fingers lingered on the edge. Then she turned it over, a faint signature on the back. She traced it slowly. Coulter watched her, wondering how someone could feel like both a stranger and a memory at the same time. In the early hours before dawn, Coulter woke to a sound he hadn't heard in years. Laughter, soft, fragile, but real. He rose from bed, walked barefoot to the main room. Mason was awake, giggling. Yes, giggling as Nayeli tapped out a goofy rhythm on the drum. 1, 2, 3. Thump, 1, 2. Slap. The kind of silly pattern that invited play. And then, just for a second, Mason let out a small breath and whispered something. Coulter's knees buckled. "Mama," Mason said, barely audible as he rested his head on Nayeli's shoulder. She froze. Her eyes welled, but she didn't move away. Coulter turned, leaned against the wall, and let the tears fall silently. The morning came soft and golden, with sunlight filtering through the frost-laced windows like something shy and long forgotten. In the warmth of the cabin, the scent of black coffee mingled with cedar smoke, and Coulter stood at the stove, flipping pancakes, something he hadn't done in months. He glanced over his shoulder. Mason sat at the table, still in his pajamas, drumming softly with 2 wooden spoons. Across from him, Nayeli offered a faint, almost secret smile. With each beat, her eyes filled with quiet wonder. There was a rhythm in the room, not just the drumming, but something deeper. A pulse returning to a house that had grown too silent. Coulter poured syrup over Mason's plate, then slid one toward Nayeli. "Not much," he said, shrugging, "but it's warm." She nodded, her hands folding neatly in her lap before lifting the fork. No words passed between them, yet the air felt full. Coulter sat down, watching her with careful eyes. The color had returned to her cheeks. The shadows under her eyes had lightened. She was recovering. More than that, she was adapting. After breakfast, she helped Mason dress, and even combed his hair with the gentleness of someone who had done it 1,000 times. Though Coulter knew she hadn't, that unspoken tenderness made his chest tighten. He found himself stepping outside. not because he had work, but because he needed a moment to breathe. The sky was wide open, windless, the kind of winter day where you could almost believe spring might come early. Coulter walked the edge of his land, hands deep in his coat pockets. His mind wouldn't quiet. He wasn't a man prone to fantasy, but there was something about her, about the way she'd entered their lives, the effect she had on Mason, the sudden return of warmth to a home that had been dying by inches. Who was she? And what did she want? Later that afternoon, Coulter returned with a bundle of firewood. He paused in the doorway, watching Nayeli knelt by the stove, showing Mason how to sew a simple pattern into leather. Her hands moved with purpose. Mason watched her like she was casting magic. "You know how to work leather?" Coulter asked. Nayeli looked up, nodded, once, then lifted the piece of hide to show a careful looping stitch. "Good work," he said. "That's Willa's old kit. I didn't know if the needle still held." At the mention of Willa's name, something flickered in Nayeli's gaze. Not confusion, recognition. Coulter set down the firewood slower than he needed to. "You heard of her?" he asked. Nayeli didn't answer, but her eyes lowered to the drum. She touched it softly, then looked back at Coulter and tapped the table twice. "What does that mean?" She pointed to the drum again, then to herself. "She gave it to you," he guessed. Nayeli paused, then shook her head. She touched the drum, then her heart, and finally placed her hand on Mason's shoulder. Coulter didn't speak. Couldn't he? Stood there for a long moment staring at the scene. His son, the girl, the drum between them, and felt the prickling edge of something he hadn't dared feel in a long time. Hope. That evening, Coulter lit the lantern early. Darkness had fallen fast, and the clouds were gathering again. A storm was coming. He could smell it in the air. After dinner, Mason curled up with a blanket by the fire, and Nayeli returned to her sewing. Coulter sat down at the table nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee. "Mind if I ask you something?" he said aloud, not expecting an answer. Nayeli looked up. "I know you don't speak," he continued, "but maybe you can nod or shake your head? That okay?" She nodded once. He took a breath. "Do you know why you were out there?" "In the snow." Nayeli looked away. Coulter tried again. "Were you running from something?" A pause, then a slow, subtle nod. His throat tightened. "Were you running to something?" Another nod. "Us?" he asked, half joking. To his surprise, she looked him straight in the eye and didn't look away. That night, as the wind howled through the canyons and the temperature dropped, Coulter sat beside the stove with his old guitar. He hadn't played in years. The strings were worn, but they still carried sound. He plucked a slow tune, half lullaby, half memory. Nayeli listened, her head tilted, her eyes soft. Mason leaned against, her eyes closed, drifting. After a few minutes, Nayeli stood, walked to a small bookshelf near the door, and pulled down a dusty sketch pad. She returned to the table, opened it, and turned it toward Coulter. He froze. On the page was a pencil, drawing faint but unmistakable of a small boy, beside a cabin holding a drum. Beneath it in tiny letters was a name, Mason. He looked up. Breath caught. "You drew this." Nayeli nodded slowly, when she pointed to the page again, then toward the window, toward the snow. "Before I found you," he whispered. She met his gaze, and finally, moved her hand in a slow, careful arc. He knew that sign. Willa used to do it. It meant I dreamed it. The storm rolled in before dawn, turning the world into a blur of white and silence. Snow swept sideways across the windows, howling against the eaves, like some ancient spirit searching for a place to settle. Inside the cabin became its own small universe, warm, flickering, and alive in ways it hadn't been for years. Coulter rose early, checking the fire and restacking the logs. He moved with care. with the practiced rhythm of a man who had long ago learned that consistency was the closest thing to control. But this morning, there was something else in his movement. Not just duty, anticipation. When he turned around, Mason was already sitting cross-legged on the floor, the drum nestled in his lap like a trusted friend. Nayeli sat behind him, quietly braiding strips of leather, her fingers as steady as her gaze. The fire popped softly. Coulter poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, watching Mason lift his hands and began to drum. It started with the rhythm he'd made before. 1-2, pause 1-2, but then he changed it, added a third beat, then a soft tap, then a pause. Then he repeated the pattern, eyes closed in concentration. Nayeli smiled, that new Coulter asked. Mason looked up, nodded, then tapped it again. This time, slower, more deliberately. Coulter listened. It sounded like something familiar, not a song he recognized exactly, but something with shape, like the heartbeat of something waking up. That yours? He asked. Mason nodded again. Coulter sat down beside him on the floor. You ever think about what music is, buddy? Mason tilted his head. It's just a story, Coulter said. Told with rhythm instead of words. Nayeli watched him closely. Her smile faded into something softer, something that held weight. Coulter looked over. You think that's what he's doing? She nodded. Then slowly she reached for the second drum, the smaller one she'd carried when Coulter found her. She held it flat in her palm, then tapped it in response to Mason's rhythm. The beats didn't match, not at first, but then, like water, finding the groove in stone, they began to sink. Coulter felt something shift in his chest. It had been so long since this house held music, since it held play, since it held joy that wasn't strained through the lens of memory. Later that morning, while Mason napped, Coulter took the opportunity to mend the barn door before the hinges froze solid. The snow had slowed, but the air was sharp, and every movement stung with cold. When he returned to the house, he found Nayeli in the kitchen, carefully measuring out dried beans and pouring water over them to soak. She moved with ease, like she belonged in the space, like she'd always known where the wooden spoons were kept and which matches lit the stove best. You cook too? Coulter asked. Half teasing, Nayeli looked up with a hint of a grin and nodded. Coulter stepped beside her. Willa used to say that food was the second language of love, right behind music. Nayeli's smile widened just a little. He watched her for a moment, then cleared his throat. You know, I don't usually let strangers into my home. She raised an eyebrow and tapped the drum beside her, once. Coulter laughed under his breath. Right, guess you're not a stranger anymore. As the beans simmered, they sat at the table and passed a small notepad back and forth. Coulter asked questions. Nayeli answered in short, written phrases. Her penmanship was precise, almost artistic. Where are you from? East of the ridgeline, near the river's bend. Do you have family? Yes, but they don't know. I'm gone. Why did you leave? A calling. A dream. Coulter paused at that one. What kind of dream? She hesitated before writing. Drumfire boy, cabin. Coulter stared at the words. So you really did see us before you came. Nayeli nodded. Then almost shyly she slid the notepad back to him with a final sentence. I was meant to find him. He didn't ask who she meant. He wasn't sure if it was Mason or him. Maybe it didn't matter. That evening, as the snow finally stopped and the sky turned violet, they all sat together near the stove. Mason lay across Nayeli's lap, dozing. Coulter picked up the guitar again and strummed something slow and mournful. I used to think music was a waste of time, he said quietly. When Willa passed, I locked the guitar away. Thought it was just noise. Nayeli didn't respond, just listened. But now, he looked at her. Now it feels like the only thing that makes sense. She reached over, placed her hand gently on his, then just for a moment squeezed. Coulter met her eyes. There was no declaration, no answers to the dozens of questions still crowding his mind. But in that touch was something undeniable. Warmth, faith beginning. That night, after Mason was tucked in and the fire was reduced to glowing embers, Coulter lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. He could hear Nayeli humming softly from the next room, a low, lulling tone that seemed to echo somewhere deep inside him. He turned on his side, eyes heavy but mind awake. Outside, the snow began to melt. Tiny rivulets trickled down the eaves. The sound was small but steady, like a heartbeat, like a promise. The days that followed unfolded with a kind of fragile magic, as though the universe were holding its breath, watching what might grow from this unlikely gathering of souls. The snow thawed, slowly dripping from the eaves in tiny rhythms that echoed the soft tapping of Mason's drum. Each morning began with warmth, pancakes, shared, glances. Small laughter. Mason had taken to speaking again, but only in fragments, one word at a time. Mostly to Nayeli drum, hot mama sing. To Coulter, it felt like watching spring bloom one petal at a time after a brutal winter. And yet, beneath the quiet joy, something unsettled stirred. It started with a truck. Coulter heard it first. Long before it reached the cabin, the groan of tires over thawing gravel, the unnatural clank of chains and tailpipes against melting ice. It wasn't a supply truck. He hadn't ordered anything, and no neighbor would bother coming up this trail in the middle of February unless something was wrong. He stepped out onto the porch, the cold biting but bearable. The sky was overcast again, low heavy. The truck crested the ridge and rolled to a stop 20 feet from the porch. Two men stepped out. The first wore a tan ranger's jacket with a badge stitched into the chest. Deputy Fields, thin taut, always smelling faintly of aftershave and suspicion. The other, a younger man Coulter didn't recognize, had a clipboard and the stiff shoulders of a government worker on his first mountain assignment. "Morning, Coulter." Fields said, tipping his hat, though his eyes didn't smile. "Mornin'," Coulter replied, keeping his stance casual. "Didn't know we had company coming." The younger man stepped forward. "I'm with the State Department of Public Safety. We received a tip about a possible endangered person seen in this area. Young native female, mid-20s, possibly injured. Last spotted near the canyon trailhead 4 days ago." Coulter's stomach tightened. "That right. We're just here to ask a few questions." The deputy added voice too, even. Coulter stepped down from the porch. "You think someone wandered this far up the ridge in a snowstorm?" The young man hesitated. "We believe she may have been running from something." Inside the cabin, Nayeli stood frozen by the window, Mason gripping her hand tightly. She didn't move, didn't flinch, just watched the men outside. "They're here for you," Mason whispered. She nodded slowly but didn't speak. Her fingers tapped once, twice on his wrist. A signal. "Stay calm." When Coulter stepped back inside, his face was unreadable. He looked at her for a long moment, then motioned for her to sit. "They're asking questions," he said. "About a missing girl. Fits your description." Nayeli lowered her eyes. "I didn't say anything," he added. "But they're not going to leave empty-handed." She looked up at him, something like apology in her eyes. But Coulter shook his head. "You don't owe me anything," he said gently. "But if you want to stay, I'll find a way." The men returned after inspecting the perimeter, claiming they'd need to file a report and return in 2 days. As the truck pulled away, the clouds finally opened, spilling a cold, relentless rain over the hills. Coulter shut the door and leaned against it, eyes closed. "Trouble?" Mason asked. Coulter opened his eyes. "Maybe." That night, Nayeli sat alone by the fire, tracing the rim of her drum with her finger. Her expression was distant. Troubled Coulter approached, crouched beside her. "You okay?" She nodded, but it wasn't convincing. "Who's looking for you?" Nayeli reached for the notepad and wrote carefully. "I left without permission. My people worry." Coulter hesitated. "Your people, like your family." "Tribe," she wrote. "They are my family." He nodded slowly. So this was more than just a hike in the woods. She met his eyes, then added, "I had a dream. I followed it." They didn't understand. Coulter exhaled. "Do you want to go back?" She looked toward the window where Mason's soft breathing filled the silence beyond. Then back at Coulter. "Not yet." The rain continued for 2 days. The cabin grew quiet again, but this time it was a waiting silence. Mason could feel it too. His drumming grew slower, more thoughtful, as if the beat itself were searching for something to hold on to. On the 3rd morning, just as the sun broke through the clouds, Nayeli found Coulter in the barn, tightening the leather strap of a saddle. "I have to go," she said. The words startled him, not just because they broke her silence, but because of the way she said them. Calm, certain, but sorrowful. Coulter set the saddle down. "They're coming back, aren't they?" She nodded. "And I can't put you and Mason in danger." He stepped forward. "What kind of danger are we talking about?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Sacred danger. Not from men, from broken trust." He didn't understand fully, but he didn't question it either. "Will you come back?" he asked. She gave the faintest of smiles. "The drum knows the way." That night, she left before dawn, carrying nothing but her drum and a blanket Coulter had folded for her. Mason cried, but didn't speak. He just stood at the door, hand pressed to the glass. Coulter stood behind him, hand on his shoulder, watching her disappear into the misty tree line. She said, "The drum knows the way," he murmured. Mason looked up at him. "Then we'll wait for the sound." The days after Nayeli left passed like smoke, shapeless, silent and hard to hold, though the house remained standing, though the fire still burned, and Coulter's hands were never idle. There was a sense that something essential had shifted. Mason didn't speak much. He didn't cry either. He just waited. Each morning he sat by the front window with the drum in his lap, tapping out the rhythms he and Nayeli once shared. Soft, tentative beats. 1, 2. Pause. 1, 2. 3. Then silence. Like a question asked in a language no one could answer. Coulter pretended not to watch. He kept himself busy splitting wood, fixing the fence, checking on the horses. But inside he felt the absence of her like a draft through a crack in the cabin wall. It wasn't just her silence. He missed. It was the stillness she brought with her, the kind that made space for healing, for listening. One afternoon, while cleaning out the storage room, Coulter came across an old cedar chest he hadn't opened in years. It had belonged to Willa. He sat cross-legged on the floor, brushing off the dust, before lifting the heavy lid. Inside were remnants of another life. Wool shawls, a bundle of letters, a small leather pouch filled with dried lavender. But beneath it all, wrapped in faded muslin, was something that made him stop breathing. A child's drawing, rough but unmistakable. A cabin surrounded by trees. A boy with a drum. A woman with long, dark hair standing beneath a spiral drawn into the sky. Coulter sat frozen. The sketch was old, older than Mason. It wasn't Willa's style. It was too primitive, too instinctive. He flipped it over on the back, and delicate handwriting was one word. Calling, he didn't know what it meant, but he knew what it felt like. A whisper from the past, a thread tied to the present. That night, Mason crawled into Coulter's bed without a word. He clutched the drum to his chest, his small face pressed into Coulter's side. Coulter didn't ask what was wrong. He simply draped an arm over his son and let the silence fill the room. Somewhere in the dark, wind stirred the trees. The next morning, Coulter made a decision. He pulled out the map from the kitchen drawer, the old one with faded markings and cryptic notations. He traced the ridgeline with his finger, then stopped at a tiny spiral symbol near the eastern bend of the creek. The same symbol Nayeli had pointed to. The same one drawn in the child's sketch from Willa's chest. He took a deep breath. "Mason," he said, unfolding the map at the table. "What would you say if we took a little trip?" Mason looked up, hopeful. "Just you and me, out east toward the river bend." Mason stood and walked to the corner, pulled on his boots without saying a word. Then he grabbed the drum. That was answer enough. They set out at sunrise the next day, the trail damp but passable after the storm. Coulter wore his pack, and Mason carried the drum carefully in both hands, never letting it touch the ground. The forest was thick, but there was a kind of peace to it, as though the trees had been waiting for them to return. After 3 hours of hiking, they reached the clearing. It was quiet, untouched. The tall pines opened to a small circle of earth, ringed by stone. At the center stood a single cedar post, weathered, but standing with a spiral carved into its surface. Coulter's breath caught. This was it. Mason walked forward, sat cross-legged at the base of the post, and began to drum slowly, reverently. Coulter stood in the stillness, the sound filling the clearing like a prayer. And then something moved. A figure stepped out from the trees on the far side of the circle. It was Nayeli. She looked thinner, her braid longer. She wore traditional dress, now simple ceremonial, but her eyes were the same. Full of knowing, she approached slowly, never taking her gaze from Mason. When she reached him, she knelt and placed her hand over his on the drum. The rhythm stilled. Coulter stepped forward, his voice husky. "You knew we'd come." She nodded. How she looked down, then back up at him, because the drum remembered. They didn't speak much after that. Words weren't necessary. Nayeli motioned for them to follow. Deeper into the woods, through a narrow pass across a frozen stream, and under the arch of fallen limbs, until they reached a second clearing. There in the center stood a circle of people, elders, women, children, all dressed in woven shawls and quiet reverence. A small fire burned at the center, and beside it stood a woman Coulter hadn't seen in over 2 years. Willa, her hair was shorter, and she leaned heavily on a carved staff, but it was her. He knew it in the shape of her hands, in the way her eyes widened and then filled with tears. Coulter dropped to his knees, Mama Mason whispered, and ran forward. Willa caught him in her arms and wept into his shoulder. She looked up at Coulter, trembling. "I didn't remember," she said through sobs, "until a few weeks ago. Then I saw the drawing Nayeli made. I saw him." Coulter crossed the circle, dropped to the ground beside them, and wrapped them both in his arms. The fire crackled. The wind held its breath. And somewhere beneath it all, the drum began to beat again. They stayed for 3 days in the hidden village beyond the ridge, a place so quiet it felt untouched by time. The people there spoke little and listened much. Everything moved slowly. Meals were cooked over open fire. Stories were told by firelight and gesture, and prayers were sung with closed eyes and open palms. Willa was different now. Coulter could feel it, not just in the physical fragility that came from years of survival, but in the stillness she carried inside her. She didn't remember everything. Not the accident, not the flood that had swept her off that back trail near the river 2 years ago. But she remembered Coulter's voice, Mason's laugh, the cabin, the drum. especially the drum. Nayeli never left her side. The night of the third day, as snow began falling lightly across the pines, the tribal elder, a woman named Ayani, whose hair was the color of frost, and whose voice hummed like old wind, invited Coulter and Willa to the center fire. Ayani placed a single hand on Willa's shoulder and spoke. She came to us with no name. She said, in accented but careful English, the water had taken it. Her voice, too. But the child, she nodded toward Nayeli. She saw the drum. She saw the cabin. She dreamed the boy. She said, "He is waiting. The sound will bring her back." Coulter didn't speak. He was afraid if he did, the spell would break, and he'd wake up, back in the hollow cabin alone again. Ayani turned to him. "You helped our daughter. When the snow took her, she walked alone. Without blessing, without tribe. But you opened your door. You gave warmth, food, fire, and now the drum has returned, full circle." She stepped forward and pressed a bundle into Coulter's hands, cloth wrapped, heavy and familiar. He opened it carefully. It was Willa's original drum, the one she'd made by hand before Mason was born, the one she'd lost in the river. The paint was faded, but the spiral symbol remained clear and strong. "I thought this was gone forever," he whispered. "It wasn't lost." Ayani said, "It was carried." The next morning, Coulter woke before dawn. The snow had stopped. A pale orange light crept across the trees, like a secret being whispered to the earth. He found Willa sitting by the fire pit, arms wrapped around her knees, eyes on the horizon. "You okay?" he asked, settling beside her. "I think so," she said softly. "It's strange, Coulter. I remember being underwater. Cold, then hands pulling me from the current, faces language. I didn't understand. But in my dreams, I heard Mason's drum. That's what brought me back." He looked at her eyes full of things he hadn't dared hope for. "You were gone so long," he said. "I tried to keep it together, for him. But it was like we were living on pause." Willa reached for his hand. Maybe now it's time to press play again. They sat like that for a long time, not rushing anything, just breathing. When they returned to the cabin, it was not as a broken family pieced back together, but as something new, something woven from threads that had unraveled and tied themselves again with stronger knots. The snow was beginning to melt in patches. The roof needed repairs. The pantry was low, but Coulter didn't feel burdened by any of it, because the house was full again. Of voices, of music, of breath. Willa moved slowly, at first reacquainting herself with every corner of the home. She found her old books still in their place, the wedding photo still tucked behind the mirror, the drawing Mason had made of her, still stuck to the refrigerator door with a rusted magnet. She cried when she saw it. So did Coulter. That afternoon, Mason dragged his parents out onto the porch, insisting on a concert. He set the drum down on the top step, sat cross-legged beside it, and began tapping a complex rhythm Coulter had never heard before. One full of pauses and lifts and sudden bursts of soft thunder. Nayeli joined him, sitting with her own drum, and matched his rhythm, beat for beat. Then Willa lifted her voice, not loud, not perfect, but clear, and began to sing a lullaby, one she had made up when Mason was still in her belly. Coulter hadn't heard it in years. He leaned against the post and closed his eyes. It was the sound of return. That evening, Nayeli sat beside the fire, her drum resting on her lap. "I should go soon," she said gently. Coulter looked up. "You sure?" She nodded. "I came to return what was lost. You don't need me here anymore. You're part of this family." "Now," Willa said. Nayeli smiled. "I'll visit. But my place is with my people, and maybe with others, still waiting to hear their own drums." Mason looked confused. "But who will drum with me?" "You will," she said. And maybe someone else will hear you, like I did." She leaned in and tapped his chest over his heart. Sound travels, but so does love. The next morning they walked her to the trailhead. The forest stood still around them, tall and protective. Nayeli turned, hugged Mason first, then Willa. When she reached Coulter, she hesitated. Then she reached into her satchel and pulled out a small object. The sketchbook. She handed it to him. "Page 30, she whispered. Then she turned and disappeared into the trees. Coulter opened the book right there on the trail. On page 30 was a new drawing. Mason, Coulter, Willa, standing on the porch, and above them in the sky, a spiral of sound. The spring thaw came late that year, reluctant and cautious, as if the land wasn't sure it could trust warmth again. But slowly, steadily the snow receded. Patches of green peeked through the white birds returned to the trees. The creek, once frozen, and still began to sing again. Inside the cabin, the rhythm of life had changed. Coulter chopped wood in the mornings, but now Mason followed him, carrying kindling in a leather sling Nayeli had left behind. Willa tended to the garden beds that had sat untouched since she disappeared, her fingers reacquainting themselves with soil and seed. They moved like a family, rediscovering their dance, awkward at times, but real. Still, Coulter couldn't shake the feeling that something remained unfinished, like a book closed too quickly or a letter left unsent. He'd found his wife. His son had spoken again. The house was full of laughter and music, but somewhere deep inside, a space still ached. It was Willa who noticed. "First, you don't sleep," she said one night, her voice soft in the quiet bedroom. "You lay there with your eyes open and your hands clenched." Coulter sighed. "I'm still waiting for it to fall apart." She turned on her side, propped her head on her arm. Why he hesitated, because it always did. Growing up, everything I loved either left or got taken, so I learned to expect it, to prepare for the fall. Willa reached for his hand. "Then maybe it's time to unlearn it." He didn't answer right away, but he didn't close his eyes either. A week later, a knock came at the door, not sharp or urgent, just steady. 3 quick raps, then silence. Coulter opened it and froze. On the porch stood a man in his 60s with a long braid down his back and eyes the color of burnt copper. He wore a wool vest over a denim shirt, boots caked with travel. Behind him stood a boy, no older than Mason, holding a wooden staff. "Name's Elias," the man said. "I was told this was the home of Coulter Shaw." Coulter nodded slowly. "It is." Elias offered a small smile. "Then I believe I have something that belongs to you." He stepped aside. The boy reached into his pack and pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle. He handed it to Coulter without a word. Coulter unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a photograph, worn, water-stained, but unmistakable. It was a picture of Coulter as a child, maybe 10 years old, standing beside his father's old cabin. In his hands, a drum. His father's drum. Coulter's breath caught. "My father," he murmured. "He took this picture. I thought it was gone." Elias nodded. "It washed up on our land after the storm 2 winters ago. My grandson found it while foraging. The elders said to hold it, that the drum would call for it when it was time." Coulter looked down at the photo. "Why now? Because you've called for what you lost," Elias said, not with words, but with heart. He paused, then added, "And because Nayeli told us it was time." That evening, Coulter sat by the fire, turning the photograph over and over in his hands. Mason lay nearby, sketching with charcoal on scrap paper. Willa was mending one of Coulter's jackets, humming an old tune. "Do you remember this?" Coulter asked quietly, holding the photo out to her. Willa smiled faintly. "That drum." Your dad's. You used to say it could talk to the mountains." Coulter laughed under his breath. "I was a strange kid." "No," she said. "You were listening. Even back then." He leaned back in his chair, eyes on the flames. "Funny thing is, I thought this picture was just a memory. I buried it with the drum when I gave up on hoping Willa looked at him. And now," he looked down at the boy drawing by the hearth, the woman stitching beside him, the photo in his hand, and the beat of the drum still lingering in the walls of the cabin. "Now," he said, "I think I've finally found the one thing I lost." The next morning, Coulter climbed the hill behind the cabin, the photograph tucked in his shirt pocket. The air was cool, but the wind had softened. The earth felt forgiving under his boots. He stopped at the ridge where the view opened wide, miles of forest rolling toward the horizon. This had been his father's favorite spot, the place where Coulter had first learned to listen. Not with ears, but with stillness, he took the photo from his pocket, held it up to the light, then slowly he pressed it to the bark of the old pine tree and nailed it gently in place. A tribute. Not to the past, but to the boy he used to be, to the man he became, to the sound that had called it all home again. That night, Mason brought his drum to the porch and tapped out a new rhythm. It wasn't like the ones he used to play. This one was faster. Confident, it had weight to it, purpose. Coulter joined him with his guitar, and Willa added her voice, still soft, but steadier now. The stars blinked above them, the wind held its breath. And in the distance, just beyond the trees, another drum echoed in reply. The days grew longer, the light stretching its fingers into every forgotten corner of the cabin. For the first time in years, the calendar on the wall was used again, not to count down the days since a loss, but to mark the ones they were now blessed to live. Willa took to keeping a small garden journal. Mason spent his afternoons sketching and collecting leaves, and Coulter, often the last to sleep, spent his nights restoring the old shelves, fixing what time had worn down. It wasn't just wood he was rebuilding. It was rhythm, trust, a life. Yet something still lingered between them, not doubt, not sorrow, but the ache of transition. It came out in small ways. When Willa hesitated before stepping into her old closet, as if unsure if her clothes still belonged to her. When Mason reached for Coulter's hand in the middle of the night, even in the safety of a full home, and in Coulter himself, when he caught his reflection, and wondered if the man staring back truly believed he deserved this miracle. One evening, as twilight softened the sky to lavender and gold, Coulter sat on the porch with Willa. The rocking chairs creaked in companionable silence, the wind combing through the trees like a lullaby. Willa watched Mason through the open window, where he sat beside the hearth, tracing his drumsticks along the floorboards in quiet rhythm. "He's different now," she said softly. "Yeah," Coulter replied. "He listens more, but he also laughs more." Willa smiled. "You know, I didn't think I'd ever see you like this again." Grounded, peaceful. "I didn't think I'd feel it," he admitted. She turned toward him. "Do you know the moment it changed?" He shook his head. "The first time I heard your voice again, you were telling Mason about the ridge, the spiral tree. I didn't know who I was yet, but I knew I was safe. I think love has memory. Even when we forget." Coulter swallowed hard. "I was so afraid we'd never find you." "But you didn't stop searching," she whispered. "Even when you didn't know you were." A few days later, a package arrived, tied with twine and bearing no return address. Inside was a small wooden box and a folded note in familiar handwriting. Coulter opened it with careful hands. The note read, "You helped me find what was missing. I hope this helps you find what you were born to build, Nayeli." He opened the box. Inside was a finely carved set of drumsticks, oak with inlaid turquoise spirals. Below them lay a blank journal bound in deerhide and a brass nameplate etched with 3 simple words, "The Shaw Music School." Coulter stared at it for a long time. Then he smiled. The next few weeks unfolded like the pages of a new chapter, being written, not rushed, not dramatic, just full of steady beauty. The kind built from ordinary days, done with extraordinary love. They began clearing the old barn. Neighbors came, some curious, some simply drawn by the idea that something old and good was being restored. Coulter built benches, Willa repainted the doors, and Mason proudly lined up his drums along one side of the room. By midsummer, the first children arrived. 3 then, 7, then more. Some shy, some bold, some who had never touched an instrument, and others who brought their own stories in minor chords. They called it the Echo School. Not because of the sound it made, but because of what it answered. And Coulter, he taught, not just rhythm or melody, but silence too. How to hear it, how to trust it, how to let it speak. One day, as the sun dipped low and golden across the field, Mason stood in front of the group, drum in hand. He played the rhythm he had first shared with Nayeli. 1, 2. Pause, 1, 2, 3. And then paused. And from the back of the room, a soft voice sang. Willa, the students went quiet, listening. Her voice had grown stronger again, still gentle, but no longer unsure. It wove around Mason's beat, like thread through cloth. Then Coulter joined in, strumming his guitar, adding depth to the pattern. Together they made music that wasn't polished but pure. And in that moment, every child in the room knew they weren't just learning how to play. They were learning how to return home. That night, Coulter sat alone on the porch, gazing at the stars. Willa joined him, handing him a warm mug of tea. "She'll come back someday," Willa said, as if reading his thoughts. "Nayeli." Willa nodded. "People like her. They don't walk away. They walk forward, but they always remember who helped them begin again." Coulter looked out over the land, the barn now glowing from the inside, with laughter and soft percussion. "I think I finally understand what the drum really meant," he said. Willa leaned her head on his shoulder. "Tell me." "It wasn't just about calling her home, or bringing you back," he paused. "It was about reminding me what was worth waiting for." Autumn arrived slowly that year, like an old friend easing into the room with stories to share. The leaves turned not in a rush, but in whispers. Burnt orange, honey gold, deep crimson. The wind came with memory in its voice. The cabin stood stronger than ever, not just in frame, but in spirit. The garden overflowed. The woodpile was high, and in the barn, now fully transformed into the Echo School, music spilled out with each passing day. But Coulter, for all the joy that surrounded him, still held a quiet space in his chest. Not emptiness exactly, not sadness. More like reverence for all that had been lost and found. One crisp morning, Mason tugged on Coulter's jacket sleeve as they crossed the field to the barn. "Can I show you something?" Coulter nodded. "Of course." Mason led him to the small hill behind the barn, where the ground sloped down toward the edge of the forest. There, tucked into the clearing, was a circle of stones, simple, flat, placed with intention. At the center stood a wooden stake carved with a spiral. Coulter's breath caught. "You made this?" Mason nodded. "It's not a grave," he said quietly. "It's a memory for Nayeli." Mason hesitated. For everything that brought her to us, Coulter crouched beside him. "You've grown a lot, kid," Mason shrugged. "You said the drum doesn't just call people, it remembers them." Coulter smiled and placed a hand on his shoulder. "It does, and so do we." Later that week, Willa stood by the kitchen window holding a letter. The envelope was made of thick paper, sealed with a piece of pressed sage. "She's coming," she said. Her voice warm, Coulter turned from the stove. Nayeli Willa nodded. She wrote that she's been traveling, listening, teaching. But she wants to visit before winter sets in. Coulter felt something loosen inside him. It'll be good to see her. She said she has something to return. On the day Nayeli arrived, the sky was clear and wide, with a wind that carried the smell of pine and distant rain. She came not on horseback, not in a truck, but on foot. Her boots were dusty, her braid longer, and her smile unchanged. Mason saw her first and ran down the porch steps without hesitation. He wrapped his arms around her waist and held on tight. Coulter followed his pace, slower, but no less certain. When he reached her, they embraced not with the shyness of strangers or the restraint of time, but with the deep familiarity of those who had seen each other's souls in silence. "You look well," he said. "So do you," she replied. "You've filled out." He chuckled. "Willa feeds me too well." "And the music?" she asked, nodding toward the barn where faint rhythms pulsed like a heartbeat. "It's alive," he said. "Thanks to you." She reached into her pack and drew out a bundle wrapped in soft cloth. "I kept this safe," she said. "But it belongs here now." Inside was a leather journal, her original sketches, notations, lyrics, and drum patterns. Some Coulter had seen. Most he hadn't. "There's a boy in Arizona," she added, 11 years old. "Draws like Mason. Hears rhythm in everything. I think I meant to help him." "Next," Coulter nodded. "You're a guide." "No," she said, her voice low. "Just a listener." That evening, they lit a fire behind the barn and gathered students, friends, and neighbors. The stars above them shimmered like scattered glass instruments, passed from hand to hand, flutes, strings, drums. No performance, just offering. Nayeli played. First, a rhythm not of arrival, but of departure. Then Mason followed. Then Willa, then Coulter. Then others, young, old, skilled, and new, until the fire was ringed with sound. And as the final note faded into the trees, Nayeli stood. She raised her drum high, then placed it gently at the center of the circle. "I leave this," she said, "not because I'm done, but because it belongs to all of you." Now, no one clapped. They didn't need to. Silence, real silence, is sometimes the loudest sound of all. That night, Coulter lay in bed, hand resting on Willa's. Mason had fallen asleep with charcoal still on his fingertips, a half-finished drawing of the circle beside his pillow. Coulter whispered into the dark, "Do you think this will last?" Willa squeezed his hand. He turned his head toward her, surprised. "Nothing good ever stays the same," she continued. "It grows, it deepens, it changes shape." She smiled. "But if it's rooted in love, it never really leaves." The wind picked up outside. Somewhere a single drum beat, and inside that cabin, nothing. Nothing felt lost anymore. The first snow of the new winter arrived quietly, sifting down through the bare branches like powdered memory. It didn't come in a storm or with thunder, but with grace, like a benediction. Coulter stood at the porch, rail mug in hand, watching Mason chase flakes with outstretched arms in the yard. Willa leaned against the doorframe, wrapped in the same shawl she wore the night she returned. Inside, the fire crackled softly, and the smell of pine and cinnamon drifted through the air. There was no urgency in the day, no tension, just presence. It had been nearly a year since Nayeli first appeared by the creek. Nearly a year since the silence in their home was broken. Not by words, but by rhythm, by healing, by the quiet miracle of someone who simply stayed. That morning, Coulter opened the doors to the Echo School for the final session of the season. Children from nearby towns had come, bundled in scarves and bright jackets, cheeks red from the cold. Their hands were clumsy on the strings and hesitant on the drums, but their joy was real, raw and full. Coulter watched them guiding, gently correcting with warmth. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The barn held its own language now, one passed through gesture, eye contact, and a shared beat. Mason stood at the front of the room beside a new student, a girl with a nervous smile and a handmade drum. He tapped a simple rhythm. She repeated it, and then smiled wider. Coulter caught Willa's eye from across the room. She nodded. It was working. After the lesson, Coulter stayed behind to clean up. He was gathering scattered sheet music when he found it a folded piece of parchment slipped between two benches. At first, he assumed it was another drawing from Mason, but when he unfolded it, he saw the delicate curves of Nayeli's handwriting. "I will always walk forward, but a piece of me will always echo here. The boy, the drum, the man who listened. None of that leaves me. I carry the sound in my chest like a compass. Some journeys don't end. They just change direction." And Coulter folded the note slowly and tucked it into the back pocket of his journal, right between a page of chords and the first student roster of the Echo School. He didn't need more than that. That evening, as dusk settled over the valley and the sky turned a soft lavender gray, Coulter, Willa, and Mason lit a lantern and walked out to the spiral tree near the ridge. It had become a tradition each season's end. One visit, one offering. Mason brought a drawing, a circle of drums surrounding a heart. Willa brought a bundle of wildflowers tied with string, and Coulter brought the first drum Nayeli had played in their home, the one she had left behind, marked with faint fingerprints and softened leather. He placed it at the base of the tree beside the stone. Mason had once declared, not a grave, but a memory. They stood there a long while, not speaking. Then, without instruction, they each placed a hand on the drum. The wind stirred, and for a moment it sounded like a heartbeat. Back at the cabin, the lights glowed from within, spilling onto the snow in golden shapes. Coulter watched his wife and son climb the porch steps ahead of him. Willa turned and held the door open, smiling gently. Mason dashed inside, his laughter already bouncing off the walls. Coulter paused at the threshold, taking it all in the firelight. The photos on the wall, the shelves lined with sketchbooks and song sheets, the warmth of a life rebuilt one note at a time. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Later that night, as the snow fell heavier and the world outside grew still, Coulter sat alone by the hearth, his guitar resting across his knees. He didn't play at first. He just listened to the breath of the house, to the echo of footsteps, laughter drumming from the day, to silence, not empty, but full. Then he strummed a single chord, let it ring, and began to sing a song he hadn't written yet, but somehow already knew. It was about snow, and loss and return, and the miracle of being found. On the mantel above the fire sat the final framed photograph, Coulter, Willa, Mason. And between them, where space once held sorrow, sat a drum, the same one that had brought her home and brought them all back to life. We'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Share your location in the comments, and let's build a warm, thoughtful community across the miles. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing meaningful stories about love, kindness, and the quiet miracles of life. Thank you for spending this time with us. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and never stop listening for the sound that brings you home.